We're live, friends. Welcome to Be Waste Wise. My name is Ranjit Anipu. I co-founded Be Waste Wise in 2013 because my co-founder Katrina Mitchell and Columbia University's Earth Engineering Center, we saw how waste or secondary resources were becoming an increasingly global issue. We also saw that there were people all around the world, some with relevant job titles and some without, and they needed access to high quality expertise. But it was only available at extremely and high carbon footprint conferences or in 200-page long PDF reports, both of which were inaccessible to decision makers. Recently, I got an invitation to attend a conference which was almost $1,000. I don't think public knowledge should be that expensive. So we've created Be Waste Wise so that we can make it more accessible, that kind of high quality expertise more accessible to people all around the world. And with the number of registrations, we have about 100 registrations for this webinar. It just shows that there is a still huge need for this kind of expertise. So we began Be Waste Wise in 2013, to provide easily understandable webinars. And since then, nearly 200 waste and circular economy professionals and leaders around the world have participated and amplified their impact. In the next 2 years, we will be organizing weekly webinars and on ongoing themes. So we look forward to your ongoing participation and support. You can support us by donating money on our website or by donating your time. If you'd like to donate your time and invest in our collective future, please reach out to us on connect@wastewise.be. Now coming to today's panel, our major focus this year has been around moderators. Adam Reed, Robert Crocker, and now we have Kat Heinrich today. Kat and I, we met in ISWA, Belgium conference in 2015, and since then we've stayed in touch, and together we're organizing this. Kat, I'll let you take from here, but before that, friends, if you're watching this live, which is the best part about Be Waste Wise, you can use the chat window below the video, and you can enter your questions there, enter your comments there, and then the panelists will get back to you with their responses to those. So with that, Kat, take over.
Thank you very much, Ranjit. So to introduce myself a little bit more, my name is Kat Heinrich, and I work as an associate consultant here in Australia for a company called Rawtech. And this is the first in a series of webinars I'm hosting together with Be Waste Wise on food waste. And the particular focus of today's webinar is about food waste legislation. So I'm really excited to be hosting this one together. We've got John on the line and Marco as well, who I'll be introducing more formally in a few moments. But I guess the challenge is that food waste is one of the biggest problems facing the world today. We know that it contributes to climate change, to resource depletion, and to food insecurity. So last year, I was lucky enough to go around the world and do a food waste tour to find out what cities and countries are doing about this challenge. And one of the themes that really stood out to me was about the power of legislation and how effective that can be in driving change. So the first speaker I'd like to introduce you to is John Fischer. John is the branch chief of the Commercial Waste Reduction and Waste Planning for the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. So in 2014, Massachusetts introduced a disposal ban on food waste. So to start, John, I just might ask you to briefly introduce yourself and your experience working in this space around the disposal ban.
Sure. Well, thank you. So we've been working on these issues in Massachusetts for a long time now, for decades. And I've been in the position I'm in right now going back to 2001. So I've been working on this a long time. We really began our focused effort on food waste back in 2011. And that's when we really picked up our focus, began working on developing the ban.
Okay, and so the ban was introduced, was it 2014, I understand? Was that right?
Right. So the ban took effect in 2014. We began working on developing it back in 2011.
Right, so a bit of a lead time there. And so who exactly is affected by the ban? What kind of businesses?
Right. So the ban applies to businesses and institutions that dispose of a ton or more per week of food material. And we estimate that's about 1,700 entities in Massachusetts.
Okay, what kind of businesses are we talking here?
So these are large food waste generators, corporate institutional food waste generators. So entities like supermarkets, colleges and universities, hospitals, large restaurants, convention centers, places like that.
Right, right. And how is like this ban actually enforced? Like, what happens if someone doesn't comply with the ban?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question for us because it's not what you might think. So we actually do enforcement at the facilities that receive the loads of trash. So we do not inspect at the businesses that generate the food waste, but we inspect at the point of disposal.
Okay.
So we check the loads, we identify loads that have large amounts of material, and then we identify the source of the load.
Okay, so take me through that process. So I've got a truck and I'm emptying out my load of waste at a facility. So what do I do to check if someone's put food waste in the bin that's destined to landfill?
Right. So the waste hauler does have a role there. Is that your question from the perspective of the hauler?
Yeah, from the hauler's perspective, yeah.
Yeah, so we want haulers to work with their customers if they have customers that have large amounts of food waste, to work with them to set up programs. Sometimes that's hard from a hauler's perspective. They may work with a business, and that business may say, "No, thanks. We don't we don't want to divert our food waste." So that's why we're there to go out and do the inspections and serve as a backstop to that.
And then if they're found to be doing the wrong thing, what's the penalty? Is there some sort of financial penalty or something like that for doing the wrong thing? Or
There is. So the way that works is the first violation we see is not a penalty, it's an enforcement notice. And then from there, we will issue penalties if we see a second violation from a business. And that penalty is $860 to $1,000 per violation. So it's not a large penalty, but most businesses are more concerned about just getting the enforcement period.
And so they can't dispose, I understand, to landfill or to incinerators. What are their options there in Massachusetts to comply with the ban? What other kind of services can they use to manage their organic waste?
Sure. So that's obviously critical. If we don't have good options, we really can't have an effective ban. So we have compost operations in Massachusetts that take food material. We have anaerobic digestion operations that take the food material and convert it to energy and fertilizer. We also have farms that take food material for animal feed. And then, so all of those are offsite options for the so-called food waste, the wasted food. But then increasingly, we're working with businesses to just try to reduce their food waste up front through changes in their food service operation, and also to donate food that's still good to serve to feed people.
And so take us back a little bit, John, to the time when the ban was introduced, or originally the inception was in 2011, and then it was formally introduced in 2014. What was the thinking behind introducing a disposal ban on food waste? Why was that seen as an important step to take in Massachusetts?
Sure. So, we in Massachusetts, we have very limited disposal capacity. So we have very few landfills, and most of those are closing by 2030. So we have a disposal capacity problem. And we also have a problem of wasted resources. We have food waste represents about a quarter of our trash, but it's also a critical resource for our society, as we know. So we know that to be effective at reducing our disposal, we have to focus on food waste. But there are so many other good reasons just because it's such a valuable resource. So, we came at it from the waste perspective to begin with. But, then we realized all the other opportunities involved with this and why it was so important to not just get food waste out of the trash, but get it to a higher value use.
And why legislation over other approaches in particular? Was there options at the time in 2011 to compost waste? Why weren't people doing that enough at the time?
Yeah, so we view, well, the first thing is that these regulations, we've had waste ban regulations for a lot of material going back to 1990. So it's a well-established approach in Massachusetts, and we've been using waste bans for a long time. So it was a logical policy option for us. But at the same time, sorry, I blanked on your question. So why the bans, right? So, and why not voluntary? So, we did have some progress with companies setting up food waste diversion programs, but what we found is that the waste bans often act as a market development driver. So they send a market signal for companies that all of this material will be available here in Massachusetts. So that helps serve as an incentive for anaerobic digestion operations and compost operators and food waste haulers and all these entities to come into Massachusetts and build the market to help support the diversion. So we feel like you do need some diversion to support the ban, but then the ban can help further drive increased diversion.
Oh, interesting. And so back in 2014, what was the amount of food waste that was being diverted back then compared to today? Where are the tons per year diverted today?
Sure. So we have an estimate of that. Actually, I wish I had a better number back in 2014, but our estimate was that we were diverting about 100,000 tons a year from disposal back in 2014. And our data today shows about 280,000 tons per year being diverted. So that's been our growth so far.
Well, that's a significant jump, more than double
Yes.
increase in diversion. So that's a really fantastic outcome, really. And what about some of the other impacts? What have been some of the economic or financial impacts of the ban?
Sure. So we've seen the ban has helped support job growth. We have about 500 jobs in that sector, which is not a huge number, but it's a nice number, and it indirectly supports about 900 jobs. We also have seen a big growth in customers signing up for food waste collection. We've gone from about 1,350 to about 2,300. We've seen a growth in I think it's around $75 million in economic activity associated with the ban. And we're also excited now to see the food rescue infrastructure that's built up around the ban, which I think is a really important economic benefit as well.
So lots of good outcomes there. And did you face any resistance when you first tried to introduce the ban? Was there any kickback from the industry?
There really wasn't, actually. So we spent a number of years working with our Massachusetts Food Association to set up voluntary programs ahead of the ban. And through those programs, we were able to show that they could divert their food waste cost effectively. So they were able to do this and save money doing it, at least for supermarkets. So we knew, there was an economic opportunity there for the generators. So when we started working with other businesses, restaurants and hotels and colleges and hospitals, we had a lot of credibility with the industry built up. So actually, when we went out to public comment on our regulations, we did not receive any comments from any business that opposed the regulations, which is good for a ban.
That is very surprising. And in terms of what were the key communications messages you were telling to sell the ban to the industry? What were the kinds of things, the benefits you were saying?
Sure. So I think, one thing is that, we spent a lot of time talking with businesses about the ban. We tried to get everyone to the table. We had a lot of meetings with stakeholders. We shared information. As I mentioned earlier, we took about 3 years to develop the ban. So businesses had a lot of time to comply. The cost effectiveness message was really important. So we told businesses, if you do this right, you can save money doing it. And then we also rolled out a technical assistance program called Recycling Works in Massachusetts. So through that program, we were able to help businesses that wanted extra help setting up a program and help them to comply.
Okay. So it was really that planning that, saw it be a very successful ban and a well-accepted ban. I think I was reading some news clips at the time, and I know John and I have spoken earlier about this ban, which is why I presented it, wanted to have John speak today about it, is because it really didn't get much kickback. And I was really curious about, what is it about that design? And from what I'm hearing, John, is really the 3-year lead time that matters, and having that cost-effective options for businesses. So just talking about economics, because it does vary a lot from country to country. And I'm just wondering, if I was a big business, a big food generator like a hospital or something like that in Massachusetts, and I had the option of landfilling my food waste or sending it to a composter, do you have an idea of what the ballpark difference in gate rate would be between those two options?
We do. So we don't have reporting, but we have a pretty good idea about the range of those fees. So for composting and anaerobic digestion, it's probably about $40 to $50 per ton of food material. And for a landfill, it's probably in the neighborhood to $70 to $80 per ton. So, and our disposal costs are climbing also. So it does cost money to set up a new collection program for food waste. But then if you divert enough of it, if you capture enough of it, then you're actually saving money on a net basis compared with what you were doing before. The key to make that work is that you have to adjust your disposal contract so you're able to realize those savings.
And is there any plan to extend the ban to capture smaller waste generators?
We're talking about that right now. Yes. So we're talking about potentially lowering the ban threshold from 1 ton per week to 1/2 ton per week, which we think would approximately double the number of businesses subject to the ban. It's a little trickier because the economics are more challenging at that scale. It's harder to save money at 1/2 ton per week versus 1 ton per week. So we need to take some more time working with all the stakeholders, try to make this as cost effective as we can. Because, last time around, that was a big factor for our success, is that we could pitch the cost effectiveness of the program. And if we can't do that, it's a lot harder. So it does help that we have a high disposal tip fees, and it also helps anaerobic digestion that we have relatively high energy costs. So those anaerobic digestion facilities can, be cost effective to operate and get enough revenue from their energy to be successful.
Those economics are such important drivers. Absolutely. All right. We have a question coming in here from Andre. Is there a resource online where I can access all the detailed data regarding food waste bans? So I think you have some information there, John, on the ban in Massachusetts. Is that right? Where there's a lot more information about the ban?
Right, we do. We have a website on our ban. If you just go to our MassDep homepage and just search for food waste, you'll get to all the information about our ban. I can't speak for other states, but for ours, you can find it fairly easily.
Yeah, and if you were putting yourself in the shoes of another city or maybe another government looking to introduce a ban, what advice would you give them?
Well, so you have to take a long time. If the economics are not there, it's very different. If you have very low disposal tip fees, I'm not sure a ban is the right approach. So I think you don't necessarily have to be able to save money complying, but you have to be able to run these programs cost effectively, at least, I think, or, at least close to cost effective. And then, taking a long time, for us, we had to move this forward gradually on kind of parallel tracks. So we had to have the infrastructure to manage the food material move forward at the same pace as the diversion programs. So that's a little tricky, but we were able to do that well. And that's important. You have to take your time, go kind of incrementally. You can't just say, okay, boom, we're going to do this in a year and that's it. You have to really take your time and be methodical about it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, John. I might move on to our next speaker now. I'd like to introduce Marco Ricci. Marco and I know each other through the International Solid Waste Association. Seems to be a common network here. And I've had the pleasure for knowing Marco for about 5 years now. And Marco is a food waste expert and works for Altereco Consulting. So first of all, Marco, if you wouldn't mind spending a couple of minutes just providing a little bit of background about yourself and your expertise in food waste.
Okay, first of all, good afternoon to everybody listening. I will take less than 2 minutes. Well, I'm managing my own consultancy, which is called Altereco. I also have the honor to be a senior expert at the Italian Composting and Biogas Association. So it's basically the association representing the industrial sector, transforming organic waste, food waste, garden waste, and other organic waste streams into compost and into biogas in the Italian case. And at ISVA International, I'm chairing the working group on biological treatment of waste, which focuses both on recycling organic waste and of pre-treating it for safe disposal into landfilling.
Thank you, Marco. And the topic I'd like to talk with you today, given that you are based in Europe and you have a lot to do with food waste, is about the upcoming mandatory separate food waste collections, which I understand will take effect in 2023, which is not that far away. So what I'm keen to understand from you is, why did the EU introduce this new requirement, and what are they hoping to achieve from it?
Well, first of all, a strict requirement on bio-waste, because the European call it bio-waste, so both on food and garden and park waste, was missing in the current legislative framework at the EU level. EU needed to address the diversity of 28 member states. Some are quite advanced in diverting food waste and send it to recycling. Some still have to improve their system. And there was a common understanding that food waste, especially in bio-waste, is the key element for realizing a circular economy at the EU level. So it took the Europeans quite some time, but today we have an existing legislation, which of course has some deadlines, 2023, as you were quoting, but it has become effective since last year. So all member states are working on that.
So who does it apply to? Is it household bio-waste only?
And I think this is very important, since John from Massachusetts was focusing, I would say, on what we call large producers. European legislation addresses municipal solid waste. So let's say household waste, if you want to name it like this, even if in some countries like Italy, where I am based in, where I am talking from today, the Italian cities are used to manage organic waste or waste from large producers together with waste collected at households. In that case, we have the European legislation has, let's say, 4 key elements or targets addressing bio-waste diversion from disposal to recycling. I may go into detail on that, but I'm waiting for the next question.
Yeah, no, please do go into detail.
Basically, first of all, at the EU level, I'm trying to make it very simple. There is a mandatory request for separate collection of bio-waste to be applied by 2023. That's what I mean. It's not so much time, and some countries are working on that right after the legislation was issued. At the same time, there's a more general request, not on bio-waste, but on municipal solid waste, which requires member states to be able to recycle 65% of their municipal waste by 2035, which means if you have ever looked at a waste composition analysis, it can't be done without food waste.
Exactly, absolutely. Okay, so no, sorry, were you going to continue there?
And third thing, there is a ban in the European legislation, which is somehow revolutionary. In some European countries, we rely on mechanic biological pre-treatment of mixed waste before disposal or to upgrade it to RDF and so on. So MBT will not be considered, so it will be banned as a recycling option from 2027. So it will be still usable to pre-treat waste, but it cannot be accounted for recycling. And the last topic, which is somehow has some similar aspects like our case in Massachusetts, is that there has been a maximum allowance of landfilling of municipal solid waste to not more than 10% by 2035.
Okay.
So it's a very combined approach with these 4 elements.
Okay, and so if I'm a city in Europe right now and I don't have a collection for bio-waste right now, what are my options? Is there a requirement on the minimum number of times that bio-waste must be collected? Can it be once a month, or does it have to be once a week? Is there any guidance on how specific those requirements are?
I would say countries, regions, and cities are free to choose and to build up their scheme as they prefer. Normally, recycling collection frequencies for food waste depend more or less on the climatic conditions and on the economic sustainability. So the more warmer it gets, the more often you collect. Just to make an example, if you're visiting Northern Italy or Central Europe, you may collect food waste once or twice per week. If you're going to Southern Italy, it's collected up to 4 times per week.
Okay, so there's flexibility on
collection
design. And can you co-collect, so you can co-collect garden waste and food waste together, or does it have to be separate food? Or?
Again, in some countries, there is a commingled or a co-collection of food and garden waste. It is a typical scheme, for example, in Central Europe, Germany, in some Austrian cases. Some other countries, like the Italian or the Mediterranean ones, are separating two schemes, one for food waste only and one for garden waste. And they normally concentrate their efforts more on food waste than on garden waste.
Okay, yeah, and those are really big volumes, obviously. And so what happens if a city or jurisdiction cannot organise this in time and they haven't got that in place by 2023? Are there any penalties, or how does that work in Europe?
Good point. Regarding European legislation, the penalty will be applied if they are at the member state level. So there's a target for each member state. Going more into detail from the Italian case, which I know quite well, there the obligation has been put on top of the single municipalities, which means that municipalities which are not fulfilling recycling targets may face an increase in disposal costs. We are using an instrument, a very common instrument in Europe, which are landfill taxes, and landfill taxes can be increased according to the fulfillment of recycling targets. Okay,
so that's in Italy. So they're managing that internally. Those
exactly.
To make comply. What about at the member states themselves? If they can't get their cities doing the right thing, will the member state then receive any penalty or anything like that?
Technically, yes. As far as we know, European legislation, this hasn't been clarified yet, but there are procedures which are in place already based on the previous legislation, which are penalizing member states which are not complying with some aspects of municipal solid waste management.
Okay, so there is a mechanism for that,
yeah.
But they're potentially yet to resolve some of the details.
European legislation may be quite generic because it has to address a variety of member states. So the target is very clear. The mandatory separate collection is very clear. How to get there is something that a single member state or a single region can choose to implement.
And how are cities and regions currently preparing? Is there much sharing of information?
Yes, there is a lot ongoing, especially thanks to, let's say, stakeholder organizations like the European Compost Network or ISVA, which are organizing regular events where experts or countries or cities from different European countries meet to compare the results and to learn from each other. The point is that success cases have always to be adapted. In other cases, it's not just a copy and paste issue, unfortunately.
That's right. And are there some general principles that you're seeing come through as themes?
Well, from lesson learned, tell us that one general principle is, if we're focusing on food waste, is to try to collect it alone, as clean as you can, and for an economical sustainability, trying to reduce at the same time the efforts or the logistics for collecting residual waste or mixed municipal solid waste. The data that John was quoting regarding gate fees for composting in landfills are almost the same that we have, for example, in Italy. So the way to make the scheme economically sustainable is working both on the differences in gate fees and on saving money on collecting waste to be disposed and investing these savings into food waste collection. Okay. And to find, of course, a break even.
And we have a question coming in. I'm just going to ask this one, Marco. I'm not sure if you have insights or not, but we have a question. Will the UK follow EU legislation? I don't know what's going on there with the legislation.
In future, we don't know. I know that they have almost aligned their legislation to the European one. It will have a more flexible approach to that, of course, but sooner or later we will have to follow at least the main goals and targets, because that's where we're moving on. Circular economy has a significant number of different aspects. One is to make really the waste management sector for municipal solid waste sustainable in Europe. So even if they're not applying, if they're not going to apply European legislation, somehow they will need to follow the main criteria. also because they have a large network of ID facilities, which are expecting to get large amounts of food waste. So the infrastructure for recycling is there in UK, and in some areas they still have to optimize the separate collection.
So there's obviously a few winners and losers out of this type of requirement. Yeah. You have the composters and the AD operators, the winners, if you like, and then you've got potentially the MBT operators and landfill operators as the losers. Was there much resistance or lobbying during the implementation of this new requirement, and how was that kind of seen in Europe? Was there much loud voices against this legislation?
There was obviously a lot of lobbying. The point is that some countries or areas may be in a difficult situation because they have an overcapacity in disposal side, which means, compared to our North American case, a significant capacity of incineration of waste. And they still have to upgrade their capacity for recycling organics into compost, into biogas. Of course, this may be a hindering factor because actually this legislation says that cities have to recycle at least, because it's minimum 65% by 2035. At the same time, it is redirecting the investment in those countries which are still in the need of building their waste treatment facilities, because European structural funds, so European money which is supporting countries or areas of Europe where there's a lack of infrastructure, cannot be used just for building disposal facilities. Because this would conflict with the main recycling targets. So this, of course, was an aspect which was considered, and which caused some headaches in some situations which need to improve.
It's fascinating to hear about Europe's case. In Australia, it's so much simpler, I think, given that we're not requiring, how many, 28, did you say? 28?
28 member states for the time being.
Yeah, to actually catch up here. I've got another question for you, Marco, coming in on the live chat feed. Regarding the new EU-led regulations coming up in 2023, will the responsibility of recycling waste be on local governments everywhere? So currently in Ireland, tenants and landlords are responsible for obtaining bins and paying for them monthly. So many households don't recycle when they could or would.
Again, this is very country specific or member state specific. The recycling target and the obligation are put in Europe on the member state level. Then we have member states which put the responsibilities on cities, or as we say in the case of our colleague here from Ireland, if I understood correctly, it can be on the single tenants. This can be completely different from one country to the other. So there is no general rules. There are some cases which are effective, some others are less effective, but this is the flexibility of the European approach, getting to the same result with different paths.
Okay. All right. Really interesting to see. It's interesting from my perspective as well to think about Australia. So we don't have bans on food waste in Australia right now. But, you know, I think it's something that might potentially be considered in the future, or maybe should be considered. I'm thinking back to John's examples before where, you know, we already have a lot of the infrastructure set up for composting, but we might want to consider a ban to really take us to that next level and get people to divert food waste. So, Marco, just for anyone listening in here at the moment, so if you're a city in Europe and you're thinking about the ban and you're aware of, you know, you need to do something, what would be the first steps you would take to actually consider how to best design your collection of food waste? How would you go about it?
First of all, you have to assess how much food waste is there and which are the large and the small producers. We learned that after 20 years, to get significant results in diverting organics from disposal to recycling, sooner or later we have to involve not only large producers but households. Households in a city like Milan, I'm located here next to Milan, are producing 75% of the food waste produced in the city. So the rest is just hotels, restaurants, and canteens, which means that sooner or later we have to design a scheme which addresses them. And the other thing is try to design the scheme so that it is as user-friendly as possible. And possible means as a city management, you are available to pay for the service. The more convenient the service is, the frequencies are, the more likely households are going to participate.
And it's interesting you touched on that case in Milan, because they have a bit of a different situation there, where it's a very high density city, but they're achieving some really high levels of food waste recycling. Can you touch on just briefly about Milan's case and how they're so successful in their food waste recycling levels?
Well, I think there are two reasons. First of all, Milan was the last city in an area of roughly some million people which decided to collect food waste. So they were in the center of an area which was collecting food waste since 15 years. They have a very trained local waste collection company, and they had an easy access to an immediate composting facility. So there was the possibility to recycle the material once collected. Again, food waste from households was the only waste stream which was not separated by households, and they were able to design a scheme which was in line with the requests of households. So once the scheme starts well, based on 15 years experience in that area, it wasn't a pilot. It was a pilot for the tricky area because it's just high-rise building, but it was nothing new for the area of Milan and for Lombardy. And they had also a very good teamwork between all local stakeholders, including the composting organization, local experts, and so on, me included. So everybody tried to support the city in order to start it as smooth and as easy as possible.
So having that local capacity to support a city transition is really important by the sounds of it. Interesting. And all right, what I might do is I might open up to some more questions from the audience on the live chat. So don't forget, you can post questions there in the live chat there. So I might also open this up to John, in case, John, if you want to unmute yourself, in case you would like to answer any of these questions too. So the first question is, what kind of byproducts from food waste treatment have the highest value or can be sold?
John, me, both. Byproducts. What kind of products can be produced? Basically two, at least in the mainstream: biogas and compost and digestate. The highest value, at least in Europe, is for biogas, but because we have in different member states a system on incentives which give an additional revenue for biogas produced on bio-waste.
Okay. And is it any different there, John, in the US?
Yeah, it's probably similar. It depends a little bit where it's going. The only thing I'd add to that, just as kind of a additional layer to that, is that also we're trying to look first now at what's the opportunity to feed people, and so what's the highest value, most nutritional, healthiest food that can go to a food donation route, which I think that's the highest value. So we want to. We didn't really start there. We started collecting food waste for composting, but as we've gone, we're trying to place increasing emphasis on saying, how can we, using food materials, that's really our highest value.
Yeah.
That's a really good reminder, John, about the food rescue and how important that is. And I know there was a little bit of legislation in, I think it was France, Marco, correct me if I'm wrong, they required supermarkets over a certain footprint to have a partnership with a food donation company to make sure they divert any food away from being disposed. Is there any more movement, Marco, in any other EU states that you're aware of to have a similar type of legislation to encourage donation of food rather than just sending it to landfill or anaerobic digestion?
Yes, there are in different countries. Germany has a lot of food donation initiative. They're called Tafel. Italy has a national policy on reducing food wastage. I must say that very often it's difficult to quote exact numbers because we see them from waste composition analysis coming into composting. The Italian experience is that food donation initiative became very common after we introduced food waste collection, because people became aware that there was something to save, which was just thrown at the same bin before. So for us, intensive collection scheme on food waste educated people to be more careful on what they were throwing away.
That's really fascinating and interesting when you say that. I think that's the experience in Australia, that before you have a separate food waste collection, or actually here we separate food waste but then mix it with garden waste, people thought, oh, I don't waste any food. What are you talking about? And it's always interesting to see that perception change as soon as you have a separate little kitchen caddy to sort your food scraps and realise just how much food is being wasted. I've got another one here, another question in the live chat feed from Alexander. In the new EU regulations, will there be a hierarchy suggested in the treatment options for food waste? Use it as food feed. I think that's used as feed as animals, I think. Energy recovery, composting, or all options will be considered on the same level?
There is actually, I forgot to mention that there was a fifth element, which is preventing food waste production, also at the EU level. So there actually is already a hierarchy. So material recycling comes first, and on top they added the reduction target for food waste produced. And of course, energy recovery comes secondary compared to material recycling. But this was already in the former version of the legislation.
Okay, so would AD and composting be on the same level? They're not fussy on which one you choose as long
as there won't be a fight on that. The point is, as long as it's recovery, it's good. What won't be acceptable would be disposal.
Okay. All right, and I've got another question here from Ranjith, actually. India drafted in 2000 mandated all cities to ban organic waste from entering landfills, but even in 2019, none of them comply with it. How should emerging economies think about when and how to implement food waste banning legislation? So I invite you both to answer that one.
John, would you like to answer first?
Sure, I'll take a shot. So I'm not sure how specifically I can answer it relative to emerging economies, but from my perspective here, we tried to start very slow with building blocks, and we tried to develop voluntary programs in advance of the ban, in part to demonstrate that it could work. So we could come up with successful examples, and then we could use those to help support the development of the ban and help. It provided kind of a foundation to build on and help grow organically, so to speak. That we would try to grow the food waste diversion by starting slow, building specific examples that worked, and then try to build on that success.
Okay, and
from my point of view, the point is the ban is not a strategy. A ban alone will be ineffective, as our friend here is quoting from India. I mean, you need a phased implementation of any strategy, and a ban can be one of the instruments. But the shared target should be to recycle organics. And a ban alone wouldn't be effective, because I could realize it easily by just pre-treating waste by MBT or by a big incineration capacity, which would fulfill the ban, but would not go into the target direction. So to implement a ban, you must have a very efficient also administration being able to command and control. So that's why we, for example, in Italy, where I'm living in, there has never been a ban on disposing food waste, but there's always been a recycling target on top of municipalities.
Which leads me to another question, because I find it interesting, because I've been looking at a range of different case studies around food waste initiatives, and I'm always interested to see with bans how strongly they're enforced and how important that is for their effectiveness. So I think about an example from San Francisco, where they have bans for, I think they have to source separate their organics, and they have to source separate their coming of recyclables. And within the month of introducing that requirement for source separation of organics into the organics bin, the amount of organics, I think, increased, I think it was by 50% within a month. So, and that was without strong enforcement, but it was rather setting the expectation amongst the community that there is a ban, and this is the expectation and requirement now. So I'm interested in your opinions on how important is, following up with fines and penalties and enforcement versus setting an expectation in society for the effectiveness of bans.
Well, I'll start. So I think it's important. You have to have have the ban be meaningful. You want it just not to be on paper, but you want it to be a real ban that matters to businesses and actually affects their decision making. But when we started, we did not go right to enforcement. We started very gradually with enforcement, and we focused more on communication and outreach and technical assistance. And we've gradually been increasing our enforcement. Now we're doing a lot more enforcement than when we started, but we didn't want to start that way. We wanted to start by getting communication and outreach out there, making sure we weren't surprising any businesses. And then once we got that established, then we started shifting to implementing more enforcement. So I think you need a combination of approaches. Again, like Marco said, the ban can never stand alone. You need all these other pieces working together.
The same approach we have followed in Italy and other countries. Penalties are the last instrument to use. It's very important, especially for food waste, which is much more difficult to sort at home or at a production site than dry recyclables. It's very important that you have communication and feedback mechanism to those waste producers, households, name it as you wish, tenants, which are not sorting correctly. Our experience is that if this is the approach, of course, you need to have a penalty system in order to apply it when it's really necessary. But normally local authorities rely much more on effective communication and feedback mechanism than on just applying penalties to bins.
And what kind of feedback mechanisms are you talking about, Marco?
The most basic one, if we have a curbside or door-to-door collection, is a sticker system where we put a sticker on the bins where we find that food waste has not been sorted correctly, either by using plastic bags or by putting cans inside, and so that households are aware about the fact that there's something wrong, with a toll-free number which they can call, and with the possibility to have 1 or 2 days for a second pickup of a correctly sorted bin. This turned, in our experience, to be much more effective than fines.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And John, back to the case in Massachusetts. So you mentioned there was a program that you ran to help the businesses transition. How many resources was put behind that program that you ran with those businesses so they understood how to comply with the ban and what their options were?
So that program, it's called RecycleWorks in Massachusetts, and it's a statewide program, and it's for all to help businesses with composting, recycling, waste reduction of all materials across the board. We started the program in 2011, and our budget was $125,000 on an annual basis. It's now up to probably about $950,000 on an annual basis. So we grew the program gradually. We increased the breadth and depth of the program resources to help support more activity.
So that's quite a big investment in the program. And is that, just to clarify, so that's not just for the food waste side of things, but also for all the other suite of initiatives you guys do, is that right?
Right, so that's for recycling, composting, waste reduction of all materials, food waste, cardboard, bottles and cans, construction materials, the whole, any material business would generate.
Okay, yeah. And I've got another question coming in from the live feed for you, John. Is there any legislation in Massachusetts actually it's for both of you, or the EU, about food waste from supermarkets and the supply chain? Okay.
Well, so supermarkets and the supply chain are subject to our food waste ban now. So presuming they have a ton or more per week, which most of them do. So supermarkets, food manufacturers or processors or wholesalers all typically generate that amount of food waste. So they would be subject to the existing ban now, and we're working, continuing to work with them to try to get them all into compliance.
And Marco, I know you answered this question earlier when we were talking about France and the supermarkets, their requirements for donations. But the supermarkets themselves, in terms of requiring them to divert their food waste through this new legislation, will they be outside of the scope of that EU requirement for mandated separate?
No, they probably won't, because even the European legislation says that by December 2024, so after having by 2023, we have an obligation for introducing separate collection. But the year after, the Commission shall consider the setting of recycling targets for municipal and commercial bio-waste, which somehow suggests that if by 2023 we see that these targets are not sufficient, they will become even more stringent. One thing is having an obligation to collect bio-waste, as they call it in the European legislation. The other is, I'm giving you specific targets. So actually not at the European level. In single countries, yes. I'm not aware about all the legislation, all the details, but by 2024, it's likely that we will have, like in Massachusetts, probably a specific target or obligation for commercial bio-waste.
Okay. And given that there's all this activity happening across the world with bans on, disposal bans for food waste or mandated separate collection, is anyone aware of an online resource that tracks food waste bans worldwide and their results and cost effectiveness? This is a question that's come in via the live chat feed. Is there any resource that kind of pulls all this together for legislation?
Not as I'm aware. I mean, looking at bans or legislation and the effects on cost effectiveness is difficult. There might be one or two documents issued a couple of years ago by JRC, which is somehow the agency which is producing top-level reports on behalf of the European Commission, which are addressing the cost effectiveness. And not by chance, there is a case included in the Milan area, which is showing the cost effectiveness of the collection schemes in those areas, but of course compared to the legislation which applies to Italy.
Okay. And in the US, John, are you aware of any central resources relating to bans?
So I'm not sure about like an online resource that's updated, but I think the two organizations that come to mind are Biocycle Magazine and the Harvard Food Law Policy Clinic. I think both of them have tracked this. And the one other one actually is ReFed. I think ReFed may have some information about food waste bans. At least, I'm not sure if it's international, but at least across the US, I believe.
And this webinar will be available afterwards through Be Wastewise. So I will also be sharing it on beyondfoodwaste.com, which is my blog. And on that site, there are some case studies there of landfill bans, but that's certainly not the whole collection. But, there's probably a need to share more resources and information on the different experiences with them. And they do seem to be a really important instrument for driving food waste outcomes. So I just want to finish on one question to each of the panelists. I'll start with you, John. Any key takeaways for the audience today on, what are some of the key messages you would like to leave with them if they remember three things, what would they be from this webinar regarding food waste legislation?
So I think, I'll keep this relative to bans. So the first thing would be, it's really important, Marco spoke about this, it's important to take a comprehensive approach to developing a ban. A ban can never stand alone. It has to be part of a comprehensive approach. I think also a second point would be that in my experience, it works very well to develop bans incrementally over time so that the infrastructure and the diversion come along together. And then the third thing, we spoke about enforcement a little bit. I think again, enforcement is important as an element, but it's also important that it's driven by, that compliance is driven by a combination of outreach and assistance and enforcement, and not enforcement alone.
Okay, thank you, John. And Marco?
Yes, I would add that you need targets, so no bans without targets, and maybe no targets without bans, of course. So the two are part of a consistent strategy. And looking for where I've seen food waste collection the last 22 years, I would say that surprisingly for many local authorities, it works much better than you expect, and people do participate much more proactively than you could imagine. Of course, it's really a tectonic shift in habits, and this is the most difficult part, which cannot be done by design, but has to be done by effective communication. So don't forget, it's about people's habits, not just about waste. And if you consider this, it will go much smoother and easier than you think.
Thank you, Marco, and thank you, John, for your time and sharing your expertise today. And yeah, I would like to also thank Be Wastewise for hosting today's webinar. I understand it will be available afterwards for those who'd like to catch up. I will also be sharing some of the key messages on beyondfoodwaste.com, which is the blog I run with Gijs Langeveld from the Netherlands, capturing best practice food waste initiatives. So I encourage you to jump across there to take a look at that too. So I'll pass back to Ranjith now. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Kat. Thanks, John and Marco. Friends, Kat and Gijs Langeveld have a blog called Beyond Food Waste, which she just mentioned. Go and take a look there. They have some, good stuff there. Thanks for joining us today. And all of this will be available as a replay, so you can share the link with your friends and network. Sharing is loving, or caring. So. What else? That's it. So have a good day, good night, and good evening, and see you again on Wednesday with a panel on social enterprises with Kate Bailey and Eric Lombardi. So see you guys then.
Thank you, Ranjith.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.